Well, hello, friends. Uh, Normally, I would be able to say good evening or good afternoon or good morning, but given the nature of this year's convention, where all around the world people are tuning in, let me just leave it with hello and greetings. Wanted to spend just a little bit of time together to consider something related to our theme for this convention, cycles of awareness. So just to take a little time to talk something about this idea of cycles, particularly cycles of awareness and how we are affected by them and how we can interact in a proactive and productive way. So obviously cycles are one of those things that affect us at every given level. They are so omnipresent that very much they seem to go unexamined very often. H.P. Blavatsky, in her introduction to the Secret Doctrine, where she speaks about three fundamental propositions, moves in on this subject of cycles in her second proposition, in which she notes that cycles are something that are so common, so universal, that we are constantly in the presence of some form of cycle, and we're always aware at some level. She lists specifically the idea of day and night, life and death, sleeping and waking, as being just such common, such a part of our everyday experience, that they indicate to us the presence of what she describes as a fundamental law of the universe. So this is the approach that we want to take with this as we talk about it. There are so many cycles, many of which we are aware of at the personal level. Day and night, the cycles of the seasons, all of those sorts of things we're aware of. But there are cycles at many, many other levels within which we participate, although largely unaware. There are very, very minute cycles that are taking place continuously. I mean, even within the body. Probably most of you were not aware that during the course of this past day, there were more than 2 trillion new cells that were formed within the body. This process of cell replication, cell destruction, and cell replication is something that is continuous and ongoing even while we sleep. But it's too small for us to be aware of. Anything related to the spectrum of light or the electromagnetic spectrum takes place along a range of cycles, everything from visible light to gamma rays. But some of those are so rapid and so fast we can't even conceive of the speed at which they function. These things are micro, small beneath the level of our perception. Then, of course, there are much grander cycles, macro cycles. Just as we have a year in our normal way of experiencing it, where every 365 days the Earth makes a circuit around its center, which is the sun, that's 365 days. But similarly, the solar system and the sun to which we are attached, it has a similar cycle where it circles the center of this particular Milky Way galaxy. It takes a little longer than the year that we count. In fact, it takes 225 to 250 million years to make this particular galactic annual cycle. So this is a huge cycle of time. In our theosophical studies and in the teachings of the ancient wisdom, they speak in terms of even grander cycles within which we are involved, cycles of pralaya and manvantara, cycles of sleeping and waking and activity, but this is in terms of universes that are drawn in and breathed out. It's described as the great breath. So universes come into being, have their time, which seems endless or eternal in our counting, but then are breathed back in and sleep. And this is a cycle as well, a grand cycle, too large, too grand for us to have any meaningful experience of it or any comprehension. So these are some examples of cycles. In this earthly life to which we are all bound, there are countless other cycles. I mean, the body, the material body, is composed of many, many different elements. And there is this idea that is expressed as the Geo Chemical Cycle. So the biological, geological, and chemical cycles, there are multiple cycles, that are involved in the circulating of the atoms that compose the bodies of every living creature. The basic idea behind this is that within the earth, there is a limited amount of matter. It's a closed system. New matter isn't suddenly coming into being. New matter is not coming into the earth except for those meteorites that fall upon the earth's surface. But the same matter that was here initially is here now. And for every living organism that comes into being, basically it is recycling those atoms that have been present before. The idea goes to the point that a mathematician did the consideration. And the idea was to ask how many of William Shakespeare's atoms each one of us has in our bodies. And by doing a calculation, you can figure how much matter there is in the earth, that which is not locked up in its core, and how many atoms. And based on this computation, the man figured that each one of us has approximately 6 billion atoms of William Shakespeare in our bodies. For many people, that might be some sort of encouragement to try and write some additional sonnets or, come up with the next act in one of his plays. But 6 billion within our bodies is like nothing. The numbers that such people throw around is 10 followed by 27 zeros is the number of atoms in the body. Incalculable. It makes a grain of sand on a beach look large. So each of us are composed of the same matters that were in the body of Shakespeare, in the body of Buddha, in the body of Jesus, and in the body of countless saints as well as scoundrels who have inhabited the planet throughout history. In a way, it should be something that could make us think about the interdependent nature, the interrelatedness of all life, the oneness of all life, if we were to actually give it some thought. But these examples of cycles that I've been talking about up to this point, these are all cycles in nature, natural cycles. For those of us who find ourselves drawn to what we might describe as a spiritual path, then a question should come to mind, for each of us as perhaps a spiritual practitioner. We need to ask ourselves, is it possible for us to rise beyond these various cycles in which we are enmeshed? For the person who is a spiritually oriented or spiritually aspirational person, you find yourself asking, is freedom a possibility? So bound do we seem to be in these various cycles of nature. At a certain level, it is clear that we are chained to nature and to all of its various cycles. For any embodied being, for any being that has a material body, such as the human being, nature is inescapable. And probably it could be said that nature is very brutal in its practices, in its cycles. The weak do not survive in nature. But then again, neither do the strong. Ultimately, anything, anyone that is born is engaged in a certain cycle, a cycle of birth, of growth, of decline, and of what we describe as death. And that applies to anyone. You look at the greatest among us. Buddha passed through this cycle. Jesus, the same thing, whether it's a human being, a tree, a star, a galaxy. The natural cycle is identical. Every one of us passes through this. These cycles in nature are all worthy of study and understanding so that we can interact with that aspect of our being intelligently. But for the person who finds themselves drawn to a spiritual path, there are other cycles, and there is another cycle particularly that is supremely important to become aware of. We're talking about cycles of consciousness, cycles of awareness. In the language of Eastern spirituality, there's a term that cuts across all of the various practices typical to India, for instance, all of the various traditions. And the word is samsara, a Sanskrit word which literally means wandering. But it's very descriptive of a cycle in which we are all, as sentient, as beings with consciousness, engaged in. It describes the repetitive cycle of birth, of suffering, of death, that is fueled and continued by what is described as ignorance. Ignorance not being the same as not knowing, but the idea that everything that we perceive as real is incorrect. So fueled by ignorance, this cycle of repetitive birth, decline, death, suffering continues. And it's often depicted as a wheel that has various stations on it. And much like the cycles in nature, we find ourselves chained to this cycle of samsara, with one very important difference. The difference is that the reason we are so closely linked to this constant rebirth and the suffering that it entails is because of unawareness. Awareness permits for the ending of this particular cycle. To become aware presents the possibility of freedom. That possibility arises with the rising of awareness. So, awareness then being so important, the question we have to ask ourselves is awareness of what? I mean, it's not enough to know that this cycle exists, although that is a beginning, because for many, that level of consideration hasn't even been given to it. But the all-important awareness is an awareness of the all-importance, the primacy of consciousness. Consciousness is not bound to matter. Consciousness participates in matter, expresses itself through, but it's not identical with it, and it's not bound to those processes. And all of the spiritual traditions of the world, and the ageless wisdom that embodies theosophy, points to and gives guidance in how it is that we address this process, how it is that we find the possibility for freedom that allows us to first see the cycle in which we are continually engaged and perpetuating, and then to actually find a way to interrupt that cycle. This is the basis of any valid spiritual tradition, and they all give guidance on these things. In the many spiritual traditions of the world, point to a very important sort of beginning point for loosening the bonds of this grip we find ourselves in. And it begins with an awareness that just as we see from our study or just casual observation of the way things seem to work, it does in fact seem that everybody that comes into this world leaves. That the idea that every single body dies and then something happens. To people who don't give any thought to it, it's one of those frightening mysteries. But the first step always is to become aware of a certain impermanence. We're not here forever. Anybody comes and everybody goes. And when we become aware of that, not just as a general idea, but the idea that in fact this is something that occurs and it will happen to me. That type of thinking leads us to next steps, or it can. One of the interesting facts of our time, the estimate is that approximately 1 in every 8 people has had something that's described as a near-death experience, NDE. And so there are people who have, for various reasons, often it's because nowadays, because they've become so good at resuscitating people who have heart attacks. It used to be if you had a heart attack, that was it. You didn't have a near-death experience, you had a death experience. But nowadays, with their abilities to resuscitate people from these conditions, many, many people have had the experience of consciousness separating from the body being pronounced dead, and yet they have full awareness, and they find that the consciousness, upon being loosed from the body, continues to have experiences, many of which are described, and the similarities between these are quite remarkable. But for people who have had this experience, and probably all of us know some, it does seem as if it changes them. That on a fundamental level, they become aware of something which previously was not part of their experience. And at least for the people I have known, they have returned from this sort of experience with a different way, a different approach, different priorities in their life. One of the things that's true for the teachings of the theosophical body of ageless wisdom, you find it also in the Bhagavad Gita. There's this idea of what it is that actually happens at the moment of death. But the way it's described in the Bhagavad Gita is that at the moment of death, each person goes to what was their ruling passion in life. So someone who was a materialist is drawn into a material realm on this other side, or their minds are fixated upon matter, which is no longer available to them. For someone who had an idea of a heaven world, they're drawn toward that as their ruling passion. Whatever has been our ruling passion in life is what we are drawn toward, or probably more correctly, we could say, are propelled to. The same thing comes up in the Mahatma letters, in one of the letters from KH. So each one of us has this experience. And so for people who have recognized this, then it sets in motion a possibility. The possibility being that whatever is or has been the ruling passion, that we can recognize that we have some choice in this matter. Just because the TV is on, or just because the newspaper is on the table, or just because somebody is telling some interesting, gossipy sort of story, doesn't mean that we have to become absorbed in that. We can choose how and where we place our attention, how and where we place our consciousness. All of the spiritual traditions of the world give guidelines in how to further this prioritizing of the use of our consciousness, of its unfoldment. In Mahayana Buddhism, there is a very powerful and I think something that is really effective in terms of an approach to focusing, to prioritizing the life energies. The basic idea is that we're here for a short time, and so how do we use that time? And then it's often expressed that we look around and judge for ourselves what it is that might be useful. In Mahayana Buddhism, there is always the example of the Buddha that's held up before everyone, the enlightened one, whose earlier life is known, the story of the Buddha, before he became the Buddha, he's thought of in this phase of seeking enlightenment as the bodhisattva. So a bodhisattva is one who has pledged themselves to a very specific, what is described as bodhisattva vow. So that vow takes many forms, but in short, the vow of the bodhisattva is, I will attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. So this is the priority that is undertaken. And in this particular tradition, it's undertaken in the form of an internal vow that is taken, that is intended to shape our behavior going forward. It's not just like a New Year's resolution, although, obviously in such a lofty goal, it's certain that we will fail again and again. But the idea is that we continue to try, that if in fact it's something that is significant enough that it becomes a vow or an oath that we take, then it's something that we may stray from, but we will always try to come back to. This is in Mahayana Buddhism. So the idea being that we prepare our consciousness, we deepen our awareness with the aim that it can be something of benefit to others. At the Feet of the Master, the young Krishnamurti points out a similar thing when he talks about how it is we are to study, what it is that we are to fix our attention on with the idea of liberating the mind. And, the things we can study obviously are infinite. Just on my bookshelf, the last time I moved from Wheaton, where I was living, to Chicago, I had to get rid of 30 boxes of books. Prior to that, when I moved from Chicago out to Wheaton, in Illinois, when I was president of the American section, I had to get rid of 70 boxes of books just to have 70 boxes of books left. So there's an infinite amount of things we can study. Books are coming out every day, and it's endless. So what do you study? What is it that will be most valuable and most useful in this bodhisattva sort of ideal? And Krishnamurti's statement was that you study, but you study first that which will most help you to help others. That's the standard. And that's broad. So similarly, this is, again, the idea of discrimination, the idea of developing an approach, developing a discernment that can tell what's good, what's better, what's best, and then trying to apply it. H.P. Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society, the principal founder, late in her life, she became a little bit dissatisfied with the growth and the progress of the Theosophical Society, of this theosophical movement, and the way it was expressing itself. At its very beginnings, she was instrumental in attracting attention to theosophy. And one of the ways she did it, was quite well known for producing a variety of phenomena, just things that didn't occur in the normal course of day-to-day. Levitating things, having things knock on tables and walls, and just a remarkable array that were witnessed and people wanted to try to understand. This was her initial motivation, to present these things because it would be something that would attract attention of a thinking group of people. And it did that. And so you found that the Theosophical Society's ranks swelled with people who were fascinated with phenomena. Out of those, only a very few had a great interest in what was behind the production of those things. What was it? What was the bigger picture that these things connected one to? A lot of people were interested in the circus aspect. So she became rather dissatisfied with the fact that there were so few who really were looking to change, who really were looking to impact the world with this principle, fundamental idea of brotherhood, unity, the oneness of all life. To find a living expression of that was the focus. And that was the thing that everybody seemed to miss. And so at a certain stage in her life, she described the Theosophical Society in two ways. First, she said that it was a stupendous success. It was a stupendous success in terms of presenting these formerly exotic ideas such as reincarnation, karma, states of consciousness, the idea that this is an intelligent universe throughout its parts, there is no empty space, the ideas of self-responsibility, that we are instrumental in the unfoldment of our consciousness or in constricting it. All of these ideas that were presented, that the Theosophical Society was a stupendous success in terms of broadening the view, in terms of putting these ideas at the doorsteps of a global audience, whereas before no such consideration was possible. So it was very successful in that. In this same note that she wrote, she said the Theosophical Society was also a dead failure. And it's challenging to try and think about how these two ideas can fit together. On the one hand, a stupendous success. On the other hand, a dead failure. But it was in terms of the different avenues in which the efforts and the unfoldment of this body of people that was called the Theosophical Society were moving along different lines. The one, the passing and the sharing of an information and conceptual source was very well developed. But in its main function, which was to be a nucleus of what was then described as the universal brotherhood of humanity, of the unity of humanity, the non-separateness of humanity as one whole and something that can be expressed in the lives of its individual parts, us. That was something where she found that there was continually failure, that a genuine sort of fraternal, brotherly, familial relationship among people was something that was difficult to establish. And she got very frustrated with that. And toward the end of her life, she determined that she would work with a few, that the Theosophical Society's focus was on the many, but she wanted to work with a few to really ground these principles in their consciousness and to express them. And so she formed at that time what she called her inner group, small group, 12 people. And for that inner group, she talked to all of them to say that this sort of choosing to take part in this effort was something that was, in fact, quite a serious choice that one was making. It wasn't a casual sort of choice. It was something that was very serious. And so in order for someone to take part in this inner group, the people that she chose for this, there was a pledge that needed to be given. And the pledge had 6 parts, really. But the most important one was the very first aspect of this pledge. In the pledge, the very first thing that one pledged themselves to was to endeavor to make theosophy a living factor in my life. I pledge myself to endeavor to make theosophy, the ageless wisdom, a living factor in my life. And this was the basis for the coming together of this group and for what she hoped would be the really true realization of the purposes of this theosophical movement and endeavor. And the interesting thing about it, too, was that it was not just a pledge that was given to your fellow members of this inner group. It wasn't a pledge that was offered to whoever it was that was the leader or the spokesperson for this group. It was very specific because the pledge was made and the closing words to this pledge were, "So help me, my higher self." The pledge was not made to an individual. The pledge was not personal in any way. It was made to this higher self out of which all souls are emanated. She described it as universal and secondless, first without a second. This higher self, that the aid, the flowing of this higher self was what was the factor that would make this pledge real. So there is this process that a vow, that a pledge, that a determined direction, a determination of the will to direct the consciousness. There is something that this sets in motion. It begins with imagining the possibility, and then committing to that possibility. In whatever way that we are able, we commit. And this is really where the power comes. The higher self does not grant favors. It's not like the traditional sort of approach to prayer that many people engage in, which is a begging for undeserved favoritism. That's not the way these things work. So, the pledge, a commitment that is born out of a recognition that we're here for a short time, that this moment is impermanent, a recognition that all of the cycles of nature speak to our inter-involvement. I like the expression of Thich Nhat Hanh, who talks about interbeing. Literally, the atoms of our being are continually being shared. So anyone who begins to see that has the capacity to imagine, to try to conceive of a unity that goes beyond the norms of our daily experience. And any glimpse of that should draw from us a willingness, a commitment, to pursue, to place ourselves in the presence of that thinking, of that being, of that way of living, of that way of expressing and sharing with one another. That's the root of this theosophical movement and this theosophical effort. There is a time during the course of a day, a very special moment during the cycle of each day that is highly prized by artists, photographers. It's spoken of as the golden hour. It is that time right before the setting of the sun or immediately after the sun's arising, when the light that is cast upon the earth, anything that is bathed in that light seems to have a very special and particular glow. And to the eye of the artist, it's something that is highly regarded because seemingly ordinary things, when seen in this light, take on a different light, a different color, a different quality of being, is what the artist perceives. And it's something that everything has a glow, but it's not just from the light falling upon it, but it seems to activate something where the glow that is seen seems to come from within. Probably all of us have had the experience of seeing the world in these moments during the course of the proper day. This is a description of something that is understood, that is revealed in nature's daily cycles, a natural cycle, visible light. This same sort of cycle of activity is something that takes place also within this awareness cycle, this cycle of consciousness. And it happens perhaps in a couple of ways. We talk about these moments of illumination that occur in each of our lives. Generally, it's momentary, where for whatever reason, we find that something arises within us, where the barriers that we have erected over long time of thinking improperly, of misunderstanding, of unexamined living, for whatever reason, these barriers fall away. And in that moment, this higher self that HPB and others refer to has a moment where it can become present. It's no longer obstructed. And again, these are things that happen oftentimes in mysterious ways. Sometimes it happens because of the inner work we have been doing over a period of time, to see and to recognize and to address. Actually, the seeing is the way that we address these sorts of barriers within ourselves. But that's a form of illumination. But also, one of the things that was so stressed by HPB in talking about this pledge, and one of the things I believe she hoped would be communicated, was the idea that in order for someone to become actively sincere in their commitment, it requires an understanding of what it is you are committing to. Oftentimes, of course, that understanding grows over time. But she said it's very important. If theosophy, if the ageless wisdom is to become something that is an active factor in our lives, then, as she put it, we need to know something about what is this theosophy that we are talking about activating. What is it? And I think in terms of her way of approaching this pledge, she viewed it as something that was action-based. Whether that action be physical action or action with the mind. That it was something that was rooted in the active expression of a state of consciousness, of a state of awareness, of a way of seeing that moved us to express it. So, particularly, her focus was on compassionate activity. Oftentimes in various circles, people think in terms of service activity, but really we're talking about compassion as expressed in our actions toward others, and in the silent action that takes place within our own minds of how it is we regard others, our quality of seeing. So in this view, this golden hour makes itself known, makes itself felt by others in every compassionate act that flows from us, in every deepened understanding that we find a way to share with others, not just intellectual understanding, but understanding of the fabric that we are all a part of, the oneness that is at the root of this whole theosophical movement. So, act by act, thought by thought, we are bringing this golden hour, this moment, into being. And again, the spur to this is that we commit to this. The terms that Blavatsky used was a pledge, and it was a very formal sort of arrangement, but within ourselves. I mean, this is where everything begins, ends, and takes place. Within ourselves, we need to commit to something. In her model, she talked about to theosophy. Obviously, that's for someone who is involved in the Theosophical Society and this way of thinking. That is a wonderful and a powerful avenue of expression. That's the reason why it's something that is of value to all of us. But commit to something. If it is a friendship, put yourself in it. If it is a marriage, a relationship, commit to those things. One of the great scientists of the 20th century, American man, probably even unheard of by many people, a botanist by the name of George Washington Carver. He was quite renowned for the various sorts of experimentation he did with plants and the way that he was able to draw out countless sorts of unthought of or even unthinkable products that these plants were able to be created from these various forms of plant life. But he made the statement that was at the root of his whole method of scientific practice. When asked about how is it that you are able to see these sorts of expressions that are unseen to others, he made the statement that anything that you love enough will reveal its secrets. The commitment that is rooted in love is rooted in an awareness of our unity, an awareness that we function, we live, we depend upon each other, is powerful, is at the root of what we might call theosophy. So just a few thoughts to consider in this cycle that we are trying to hasten of a dawning awareness, a deepening awareness within ourselves. It's something that will do us good, but more so, or as much as it will do us good, it will do good in this world, in this moment in which we find ourselves living here. It's a good thing to not just take up space in this world. So thank you one and all, and I appreciate your attention as always, and appreciate whatever it is that you find it within your heart and your ability to commit yourselves to. It will definitely open up pathways to greater and deeper things.